Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. So, we are kicking off the Wilds of Eldraine update to my Deckbuilding Toolbox series. If you haven't checked out the rest of the series, you should give it a look. The information is not dated because we're not going to have a rotation, right? So all of the cards that I talked about from, Crimson Vow, Midnight Hunt, Streets of New Capenna, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, those are all still in. All the commentary is still valid. So check out those videos, but I'm updating the series now to include Wilds of Eldraine. And like always, I like to start with artifacts, colorless cards, I should say, and lands. So the reason I start here, well, let's talk about the purpose of the series. So when I say, a brand new day of free-to-play, I'm not being facetious. I'm not making up fibs. My account is free to play. I've spent a grand total of $20 on it the entire time that I've owned it, and I started playing this account back around Ixalan. It's been an on-again, off-again thing, but yeah, I bought like the $5 welcome bundle that has some packs and stuff. I bought the $15 one that's got gems and a City of Brass sleeve and the faceless avatar. I bought those two on this account, and I don't believe I have paid any more money since then. I mean, you could count maybe when I checked out the Hot Pockets thing. I only did that for one flavor of Hot Pockets, though. And I might have done it on the other account and not this account. So let's just say, in the years that I've owned, 5 years? Has it been 5 years that I've owned this account? I've spent like a grand total of $20. It's basically a free-to-play account. And what the Deckbuilding Toolbox series intends to do is it's part crafting guide, but you're not thoughtlessly crafting the cards that I'm telling you to craft here. You're putting on your thinking caps today, and you're considering what cards you want in your collection to brainstorm with. We're not looking to build a specific deck in this case. We're looking to cast a wide net, make a wide variety of card choices here to let you brew up a wide variety of different decks. You know for yourself whether or not that sounds like a good idea. If you're like me and you derive most of your joy in this game from creating your own decks, then this could be a very helpful guide for you. Because I want to find the pieces that are the most value, can go in the widest variety of decks. Things that you can use over and over again that help you form like a small core of useful cards that you can then build upon to craft many different decks with. So, all of that being said, let's go ahead and dive in here to the colorless cards of Wilds of Eldraine. And there aren't that many, so I'm going to go ahead and go over every single one, but when we get to the colored cards, I'm going to cherry pick out some of the best ones to look at. Alright, Candy Trail. This one, it's just a common. It gives you a Scry 2 for 1 colorless. Puts a chunk of something on the battlefield that you could sacrifice if you cared to. And if you want, you can sacrifice itself by paying 2. It replaces itself by drawing a card. You gain 3 life. So you maybe get to stall aggro a little bit. Usually it's better to stall aggro by developing your board state. But if you plan on sweeping the board anyway, then you could do worse than an effect like this. And this would be okay in a deck like Rakdos Anvil. You know, you get this artifact down, you already want to sacrifice it to its own ability, and that will trigger the Anvil to put out little 1/1 guys. Could be worse. I'm not going to tell you to run out and craft this one. I feel like the power level it's right on the borderline. Right, it's right on the borderline. Any deck could play it, but do you want to? Is it actually worth a slot in a deck of any color? I'm not sure. So I'm going to be on the fence as far as crafting this one, but it's just a common. If you think you like it, go ahead. Gingerbrute. Gingerbrute's pretty good. It's been around before. It's a reprint. But if you're new to this card, we get a 1/1 with haste that can go into any color of deck, so we can have an aggressive start in whatever color we like. It could be, you know, mono blue beat down, right? Mono black beat down, mono green beat down, whatever you like. You could have a hasty 1/1 on turn 1. If you have a mana to spare, it can't be blocked except by creatures with haste. Something you may notice if you've played the game a while is that creatures with haste don't like to block. It's also not that common of an ability, which means you can, with some reliability, make the Gingerbrute unblockable. And then you've got this fallback plan if you can sacrifice it to gain 3 life, because it's also food. Gingerbrute's pretty good. Pretty good. And for me, I'm going to go ahead and craft it. I think this is a good tool to have in the toolbox for various different aggressive strategies you might have in Standard. Because it can go in any color and it's basically playable, right? Red runs a bunch of creatures that are really no better than this, especially budget versions of red. And then there are some colors where you might have a little bit of trouble coming up with good 1-drops that you would actually want to play. Green sometimes has that issue where it's got amazing 2 and 3 drops. And at 1, you're kind of, So, I think this is a reasonable option. It's just a common. I'm going to go ahead and say to craft it. Soul Guide Lantern. This is a reprint. I believe this card already exists in Standard. You can decide for yourself if you need to craft this card if you don't already have it. It's kind of a sideboard card. You know? Exiles a card from a graveyard. You can sack it to exile each opponent's graveyard. Kind of like a Tormod's Crypt a bit. Except it costs a mana. You can also pay 1 and sack it to draw a card. So it can be what they call eggs. That's harkening all the way back to the days of Odyssey. When there was a cycle of eggs that you could sacrifice to make 2 colors of mana and draw a card. Anyway, they're little artifacts that can sacrifice to draw a card, basically. Cards like this have found niches within Standard before, so it's not impossible that it could again. Probably better as a best of 3 card rather than best of 1. I usually play best of 1. You can decide for yourself if you think you need this card. I'm not going to tell you to craft it. Alright, Agatha's Soul Cauldron. This is a really interesting one. So, saw someone make a joke that all cauldrons must have a million lines of text in Magic. It's going back to Ice Cauldron in Ice Age. So Agatha's Soul Cauldron lets you exile a card from a graveyard. It's just a tap ability, no mana. If a creature card's exiled this way, you put a +1 counter on a creature you control. I feel like that should be up here, because it's kind of more important than the other text. But whatever. Bury the lead. Put it way down here on the card. So yeah, it exiles cards from any graveyard. If you exile creatures, you get +1 counters on your creatures. That's relevant. Very relevant. And then, you may spend manas, though, or mana of any color to activate abilities of creatures you control. Okay. It does this all the time. Doesn't have to deal with the +1 counter thing. So, in a weird way, like I built that Tazri deck a while back that was a mono-white beatdown. But if you did slip a copy of Agatha's Soul Cauldron in that deck, it would allow you to activate Tazri's 5-color ability, because you would have Agatha's Soul Cauldron with that, first sentence. I'm not saying either of these are things that you would do. That video wasn't very popular. The deck was very strong, though, surprisingly. Anyway. The other bit here is creatures you control with +1/+1 counters have all activated abilities of creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. I've seen this put to use with, Voldaren Thrillseeker? The one who has backup can sacrifice the creature to deal damage equal to its power to any target. If you exile her with this card, any creature you control with a +1 counter gets that ability. And suddenly your board turns very, very lethal. All of the combat math suddenly grinds to a stop, because the opponent can't afford to take hits from you, because you could pay like 3 mana, sacrifice 3 things, and just dome them in the face for, 13 damage or something. That's neat. If you're using the Cauldron that way, you probably want all 4 copies of it. Is it worth it for other decks? That's a big question. This is legendary, which is a drawback. It means you can only have 1 in play at a time. And, it's kind of if you were a deck that was dedicated to using this, it's kind of a question if you would need more than 1 in play. Right? It's a nice piece of graveyard hate. It doesn't rip them out 2 at the time, like the, what is it, the hearse? There's a vehicle, exiles 2 cards at a time. And that one is better for graveyard hate than this one is. This one puts +1 counters on your creatures, however. This one's also legendary, and you can't crew it up as a vehicle. It's a mythic, so I would suggest crafting 1. 1 because it's legendary. 1 because it's a neat ability to have in your deck, to have access to. Having a little bit of graveyard hate can be nice. Having the ability to put +1 counters on your creatures is nice. And you may not need a second one, because there are only so many cards that go to the graveyard in a normal game of Magic. So yeah, I think you could find an argument for slipping 1 copy of this into a wide variety of decks. Just as a kind of like having a bit of a sideboard in your main deck, with the added upside that it could very probably put some +1 counters out on your creatures at instant speed. I think all of those are reasons to go ahead and say yes to a copy of this. And if you want to craft synergy around this, combo decks, what have you, then you might go in for all 4. But alright, Collector's Vault. This, I'm telling you right now, I'm going to be crafting all of them. Let's talk about Collector's Vault, because I feel like no one else is. Alright? So a while back in Standard, we had this card in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty called Reckoner Bankbuster. And it was an artifact, came down for 2 mana as a vehicle. You could pay 2 and tap and remove a counter from it. It came with 3 counters to draw a card. When you removed the last counter from it, you made a pilot that was capable of crewing the vehicle. Also, it came out at instant speed, so you could get a flash blocker, sort of, when the last counter came off. Also, when the last counter came off, you got a treasure. And in the meantime, you could crew it up with a 3-power creature to be a 4/4. The card was... showed up almost everywhere in Standard just because any deck could run it, and it was a pretty reasonable value proposition for just about any deck. Better if you could find a way to crew it. And so things that were able to crew it ended up getting played a little bit more in Standard. I don't know that it warped the format, but it was something you always had to assume would be there, that you had to play around. You always had to watch out for as a surprise blocker or attacker. This doesn't do that. This is an uncommon. But what it does do is it has no limit on the number of times it can be used, and it always makes a treasure token. This is kind of a different card, and I love it. It ramps you. It ramps you every time you use it, as long as you don't need to use the treasure token that turn, and even if you do. It's kind of like it was a 1 mana activation in that case instead of a 2 mana activation. As far as I'm concerned, this card is a big deal. It's not raw card advantage, not in the way where you're going positive on cards, but the card selection and the ramp are so absurdly good on this card. You know, anyone who's telling you this card is too slow for Standard has no idea what they're talking about. We found time, all the time, to crack clue tokens and use Reckoner Bankbuster, and right now I'm using a different artifact. It's the Investigator's Journal, which serves much the same function, and it's working quite well for me. This card pays you back some of the mana you put into it. So trying to say that it's too slow, I feel like if anything, this card might actually accelerate what your deck is trying to do. Add to that it's colorless, any deck can use it, and it's actually not just accelerating you, but fixing your colors of mana in the process as you find precisely the cards in your hand that you need. Not to mention, it's filling up your graveyard at the same time with the discards. So that could be nice. I think this is an amazing card, and I'm going to recommend crafting all 4 copies of it. And I think this is possibly one of the biggest sleeper hits of this entire set. I'm going to be crafting it here. Crafting all of it. Prophetic Prisms reprint. There have been a couple of these already in Standard, if you don't happen to own any of those. This usually doesn't quite make it into Standard decks. It's usually not quite good enough. Normally you can find lands that will be sufficient to fix your mana. It's nice that it replaces itself. It's nice that it's mana neutral. Crystal Grotto. Right, if you use Crystal Grotto's ability to filter, you didn't get to tap it for mana, which means you actually go down a mana to use it. That's not true with the Prophetic Prism. Despite these advantages, you pretty much never see it in Standard. Not that I think you couldn't run it, especially if you had like a deck that wanted to bargain it away, you know, sacrifice it, use it, maybe a Rakdos Anvil deck. There are scenarios where I could see you using a Prophetic Prism, but generally speaking, I don't think you need to run out and craft it. And there are several sets in Standard, I think, that already have this, so yeah, it's not a big deal. Scarecrow Guide. 2/1 with Reach. Reach is actually a really nice ability. Being able to block flyers surprisingly comes up all the time in Standard. And you can pay 1 colorless to add 1 mana of any color. Activate only once each turn. Basically, this guy is below rate as a 2/1. There are some things that care about 1 toughness. There's the Invasion of Urgatha that can ping something for 1 when it enters the battlefield and burns your face for 4. You'd feel really bad playing a card like this if your opponent's running that. Or red also runs the spell that deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. That would also be terrible. Basically, there's not that much upside with the Scarecrow guide. You know, at the point that it was like a 2-3 with reach, let's say. If this sucker was a 2-3 for 2 colorless mana with reach, then I think it would start seeing adoption into a bunch of decks. Maybe. Just because a 2-3 for 2 is a pretty good blockade against an aggro deck, it would be a good budget option at that point. As a 2-1, I think we're done talking about it. Sir Ginger the Mealender. So even though this card also has the 1 toughness problem, if your opponent has a Planeswalker, they can't target it. And that's kind of a big deal. Also, if they have a Planeswalker, it has trample and haste, not just hexproof. So this probably could have been named Sir Ginger the Planeswalker Ender. Whenever an artifact you control is put in a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1 counter on Sir Ginger and scry 1. Sounds pretty good for like a Rakdos Anvil deck, again. So nice artifact synergy tossed in there. And then you can pay 2 and tap and sack it. You gain life equal to its power. This is an aggressive card that can go in any color of deck. It is tech against Planeswalkers. Has an option for life gain. And has artifact synergies. If you have the artifact synergies, you might want to go in for multiple copies of this. Since it's legendary, I'm going to say 1 copy of this is a pretty reasonable craft. You have it as an option in any aggro deck that you care to make, and it can bother your opponent's Planeswalkers to no end. So yeah, 1 copy. I think that's pretty good. Alright, the Iron Crag. I'm going to keep harping on this thing about legendary permanents. I get it. You know, Wizards loves for things to be legendary. As far as I know, players like legendary things. So you're going to keep seeing legendary permanents, and every time that I analyze one, I'm going to bring up the fact that legendary is a drawback. There can be only one. Now, in the case of the Iron Crag, if you trigger its ability, first of all, this is a mana rock, and it's fantastic in that regard. It's 2 colorless mana, tap for a colorless. This is some of the best mana ramp for standard we've seen in a long time, and it works in any color. It would be amazing if it made colored mana instead of colorless. It'd also be amazing if it wasn't legendary. However, despite all of that, I still think it's pretty good. Good enough to craft 1 copy of for sure. Then this next ability, whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may, that's the keyword here, may, you may have the Iron Crag become a legendary equipment. You don't have to. You can just leave it as a mana rock. If you need a mana rock, don't flip it. It doesn't actually flip, but you know what I mean. You can just leave it as a mana rock. It's a May ability, you don't have to do it. But if you think it would be beneficial, then it's still legendary, but it gets a new name. Its name becomes Everflame Hero's Legacy, and it's an equipment. It equips for 3 colorless, and the equipped creature gets +3/+3. And the Iron Crag loses all other abilities, so it no longer taps for mana, basically. But since it comes in with a different name at that point, then you could have 2, right? You could have the equipment, and then you could play a second copy of the Iron Crag. So you'd have the mana rock and the equipment. You can't have more than that because they're both legendary. So, whether this card is worth crafting 4 of is very much up to your deck strategy. Wouldn't be the worst in Rakdos Anvil because sacrificing it for the legend roll would trigger the Anvil. But mostly I'm going to say that crafting 2 copies is probably about right. 2 copies means that you can have 2 of these mana rocks, which ups the consistency a little bit of hitting it early in the game when you'd like to accelerate. It also means the second one's not necessarily a dead draw, because you can transform the first one into a hunk of equipment if you have legendary creatures in your deck. That's a little bit of a deck building constraint. You don't even have to use it that way, though. You could run 2 copies of this in a deck with no legendary creatures just to make sure you hit one. And if the opponent blows one up, you know, with artifact removal, then you have a second one. I think crafting 2 of this is pretty reasonable. And I'm going to stick to that. Alright, 3 bowls of porridge. Uncommon, artifact food, 2 colorless. Pay 2 and tap, choose one that hasn't been chosen. So each of these is 1 time only. This deals 2 damage to target creature. Shock. But shock for more mana. Tap target creature. Okay. Not a very powerful mode, but one that you get stapled onto this shock ability as another thing you can do with it. That's fine. Sacrifice it, gain 3 life. Obviously, you can't do that one multiple times because you have to sacrifice it, but this one's interesting to me. It can be kind of small, cheap removal in like a green deck. All the other colors, other than maybe blue. Blue can bounce things. Maybe phase them. Or you just have to hold mana open to counterspell. But green and blue could use this as a little piece of removal. They can also use it as a little piece of tempo play to tap something down if the opponents prevent it from attacking. And again, as another tempo play to gain 3 life, to stall, basically. The decks I can think of that would want to use it in that way are Control and Ramp. I don't think any other style of deck probably has the time and open mana to use 3 bowls of porridge, but I feel like maybe Control and Ramp do. Now, is it worth a slot in the deck? That's, You know, if one of these modes was draw a card, I would say yes. Since that's not the case, you really want to get the 2 damage to a creature to be worth a card, basically. You want to hit something of the opponent's that made it worth a card. If you can't do that, then 3 bowls of porridge is just kind of all tempo, and all of that tempo costs mana to use. In which case, I don't know that it would be worth it. So, good enough or not, I'm not sure. Frankly, I'm not sure. I've got 107 uncommon wild cards here, though. So I'm going to craft 4 of them, and I'll get back to you. Hilda's Crown of Winter. 3 mana, rare, legendary artifact. So again, there can be only one. It's a legendary. Pay 1 and tap target creature. If it was target permanent, we'd be having a different conversation. Tap target creature. This ability costs 1 less to activate during your turn. So it's 0 during your turn. You get this 3-mana artifact. On your turn, if you want to tap their creature, it's free. Which is, you know, kind of handy. If you're getting specific value out of it, like with a Hilda deck, or maybe, if you got a tempo deck, you think it would be worth it just to clear the way, and then to have the fallback plan of being able to, like, slow them down on the, counter attack. You could maybe think about adding one copy of it into like a tempo aggro beatdown deck. Not too sure about that, though. Really not too sure about that. You can also pay 3 and sacrifice it, draw a card for each tapped creature your opponents control. The times where that's going to be good, I mean, the card can kind of engineer a situation where you draw 2. Right? You tap something on their turn, tap something on your turn, sack it to draw 2. Yeah, that'd be okay. But all the way around, I'm not sure if this card gets there. I'm not going to... Rare wild cards are precious. I'm not going to tell you to craft this one. And finally, we get to Ariete's Tempting Apple. It's an uncommon, 4 mana, legendary artifact food. So you can only have one of this out at a time. You are able to sacrifice it, though, so playing multiples isn't out of the question. When it ETBs, you gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap it, gains haste. So this gives the red threaten ability to any color. You can threaten creatures in your green deck, in your blue deck. If you're a very old blue player, you might have been able to do that anyway. Some cards like Ray of Command or whatever. In your black deck. In your white deck. It's pretty weird for white. So yeah, 4 mana is a little bit more than you want to pay for this ability. But that's good design for an artifact. Right? An artifact that lets you do an ability in any color, generally that means you're paying more mana for it. And you are in this case as well. These red threaten abilities, the going rate's like 3 mana. The ones that see play in standard tend to be less than 3 mana. You can also pay 2 and sacrifice this to gain 3, like a food. Or pay 2, sacrifice this, target opponent loses 3 life. So this can burn the opponent for 3, even if you don't have a creature to target. It's at a very bad rate for that, right? It'd be 6 mana, split up over 2 turns. To deal 3 life loss, I should say. That's not great, but it is an option. It's also possible you could, with 6 mana, steal their creature, hit them with it, make them lose 3 life, and they lose the game all in one fell swoop. Is it worth it to craft? My instincts tell me no. My instincts are telling me that it costs too much mana. I think it's interesting, though. I'm going to craft a copy just as a curiosity for my collection. I might experiment with it a little bit, but I'm not going to tell you to craft it. So that brings us to the end of artifacts here. Let's see how many wild cards. I'm not down too many here. Let's go ahead and craft it. There we go. Alright, now we're going to talk about lands. And in this case, the lands are giving me a little bit of a conundrum. Normally, I am not a big fan of crafting lands just to fix mana. I love to make budget decks, and I find that it's easy enough to find ways around tap lands. Right? Like if you can get extra land drops, which is easy to do in green. Right? You can get Azusa's Mini Journeys, or there's the new Adventure Worm, where you can plant beans, whatever it's called. For 2, get an extra land drop. The way that plays with a tap land is turn 1 you play a tap land, turn 2 you play like a forest, non-tap land of some variety. Then you play Azusa's Mini Journeys or plant beans, and you get another tap land out that turn that you probably couldn't have used 1 mana for anyway, if you're making a ramp kind of deck like that. The turn after that, you're going to have 3 or 4 mana. You know, even if it's another tap land, you'll have at least 3 mana on turn 3. And that is a pretty useful way to get onto the field quickly with tap lands. It's to get that extra land drop beat in there. Now these are interesting, not just because they make 2 colors of mana, and they are tap lands, so all that, you know, advice I just gave applies here. But they're also creature lands. Back in the day we called them man lands. So these creature lands all activate for you know, a decent chunk of mana. It varies from one to the next. And they turn into a variety of creatures whose utility is different for each card. So we're going to have to kind of look over these a bit. Restless Fortress makes white and black. They're all enemy colors. And it's pay 4, so you need 5 mana total, right? The Fortress plus 4 others. Makes a 1/4 white-black nightmare until end of turn. And whenever it attacks, the defending player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So, not bad. It can crash in even if it gets blocked. It might not die with the 4 toughness. And it has a 2-point life drain stapled onto its attack. It's also not the worst blocker. So, I feel like this is gonna see play. I mean, the same is kind of true of all of these, but this one feels like pretty good. Pretty good inclusion to me. If you happen to have life gain triggers in the deck where life gain is a useful strategy for you, then you could make even better use of this. But I think it's pretty reasonable even on its own. As far as crafting all of these, you know, if you crafted this whole set, that would be 20 rare wildcards. In good conscience, I can't recommend that you do that. 20 rare wildcards is too much to ask. But I think what you should do, maybe, if you know that you're drawn to some color combinations, is I think you should craft a couple of the ones that you're pretty sure you're going to use. You don't have to do the whole playset, but if you're pretty certain you're going to use them, then go ahead and go for it. As I said, tap lands, there are ways around it. You can find ways to fit tap lands into your curve. Alright, Restless Spire. This is the blue-red one. It has the cheapest activation. Again, they all come in tapped. They'll make 2 colors of mana. They're enemy colors. You can pay a blue and a red and this, so 3 total mana, right, counting the Spire. And this becomes a 2/1 blue and red elemental with, as long as it's your turn, this creature has first strike. It's still a land. So, pretty good attacker. Yeah, kind of difficult to block with the first strike. Not the worst. It's also a very cheap activation. Whenever it attacks, you scry 1. That can help you set up the top of your library to try to finish out the game. Because it feels like this land wants to be in at least a moderately aggressive deck. You know, it could be mid-range. If you were Control usually has enough time to set up to go for the really big effects. You know, a Control deck can afford to pay for 5 mana, or even 6, to go in with a big creature land. They stall the game out into the late game, where they get to out-card you, out-advantage you, have so much more mana they can leverage. This probably wouldn't go into a Control deck. It also probably wouldn't go into a ramp deck. But aggro or mid-range, I could probably see a home for this card. So if you know that's you, if you know that's your you know, kind of deck style, deck preference, you could craft a couple of these. Crafting 4 of them is a little bit of a hard sell because it's a tap land. And if you want to get off the ground quickly in that style of deck, You don't necessarily want to pad out the deck with too many copies of tap lands. I mean, it makes up for it by being a creature land later, which gives you kind of better inevitability, more things you can do into the late game, mana sinks, that kind of thing. So there's a trade-off there that you might consider, even if you're aggro. But this one I find the hardest sell of the bunch. That's not to say it's not good and that it might not be the one that gets the most play. Those things could happen. But just something to be aware of. Restless Cottage. I really like this one. So this is the green-black one. So it's pay 4 plus the cottage itself. It's kind of like a 5 mana investment. Becomes a 4/4 black and green horror until end of turn. Still a land. Whenever it attacks, you make a food token and exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. If anyone watching this was playing during Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, there was a creature land called Hive of the Eye Tyrant, I believe. It too had a 4 mana activation, made a 3/3 with Menace, and whenever it attacked, you exiled a card from a graveyard. Now this one doesn't have Menace, but it's a 4/4 and it makes food. It also requires another color of mana to use. I think this one's really good. I hesitate to call it the best one of the group, but, you know, maybe. Maybe. So this is an amazing card for like a mid-rangey kind of deck, maybe even like a control kind of deck. Pretty good finisher, gives you utility to hit their graveyard, gives you life gain in the form of food tokens. The food tokens are also just more stuff on the battlefield that you could sacrifice to various effects, you know, artifact synergies. All the way around, this one feels really strong. For me personally, I'm going to go ahead and craft a couple. Alright. Restless Bivouac? Not quite sure how to pronounce that. Maybe I should look it up. 1 second.
Bivouac.
Yep, Bivouac. That's how it's pronounced. Bivouac. Alright. So this is the red-white one. So for 3 mana, so total investment of 4 mana, counting the Bivouac, it becomes a 2/2 red and white ox creature. Still a land. Whenever it attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, which can be the Bivouac. So this is a creature land that can snowball over the course of a game. You know, you can sneak in and attack with this whenever the opponent's got the shields down, and it'll be a 3/3, and a 4/4, and a 5/5, and, you know, if you're able to kind of counterpunch the opponent to where they're off balance, they can't find a way to sneak in a good attack without you activating this. You know, they're ready to counter your spell, or they've tapped out, just come in with the Bivouac. Right? Play a sweeper, hit them with the Bivouac. Then they could be in trouble. This one's pretty strong. Really, the only thing holding it back is just the colors that it is. Red and white, there was a little window of time where there was a red-white aggro deck that was the bee's knees in Standard. Just, I don't know, a little while back. It was short-lived. And red-white kind of doesn't have a good core identity at the moment, other than maybe there's some reanimator decks, right, that use some of the white spells that can reanimate things out of the graveyard. Which this could have a home in those decks. That'd be fine. I feel like maybe there's some other red-white deck, though, that could be making use of this. I'm not sure what it is quite yet. I think this card's got potential. It's got the potential to be there. I'm just not sure about the color combination right now in Standard. But That's never stopped me. I'll go in and make any color of deck. I mean, I've made a whole bunch of green decks. You all know how tough it is to make a green deck out there on the ladder right now, and I'm doing it. So this could very well have a home as well. Restless Vinestalk. I also love this one, partly because I love ramp decks, so I don't mind the ones that have a big investment in the late game. And this one does. Green and blue, 5 mana, and this land. It's like a total investment of 6 mana. This becomes a 5/5 green-blue plant creature with trample. The trample part's nice. 5/5 is also nice. It sizes up well against creatures like Sheoldred, where, Sheoldred would trade with it, but she would die. You could also threaten to activate it on blocks. That's not great because they might have a removal spell, but it could hold the opponent off, maybe. Whenever this attacks, up to one other target creature has base power and toughness 3/3 until end of turn. Speaking of Sheoldred again, you don't have to do this to one of your creatures. You can do it to the opponent's creature. And if you shrink down the opponent's Sheoldred, that can let your 3/3s and 3/4s and whatever else attack in profitably, where if Sheoldred blocks, it's a trade, right? She still has Death Touch, but she's small enough to die to a lot of other creatures in Standard. That's kind of a big deal. So I really like this land. I think I'm actually going to go in for crafting my second copy of it here. And that's partly to do with my playstyle and the kinds of decks that I like to play, right? You know yourself. Audience member out there, you know whether Restless Spire or Restless Bivouac sounds more like your jam, your thing. And if it is, and if those colors are your thing, then those are the ones you should be crafting. I like to go big. I don't mind the big investment of mana. I like the ones that are green. Green is kind of my color. So Restless Cottage and Restless Vinestalk sound great to me. But you know what kinds of decks you like to craft. So you can decide for yourself which of these creature lands you want to go in for a copy or two of. Alright, that brings us down to the common and uncommon ones here. Crystal Grotto's reprint, it's already in Standard. If you don't happen to have copies of it, it's not bad. I mean, people were running Zhalfirin Void some time back, and I think all that card did was tapped for colorless mana, and you got a scry 1 when it entered the battlefield. It didn't have this whole bit down here about 1 and tap to add a mana of any color. Zhalfirin Void was just kind of a junky scry land that made colorless. People ran it. For that same reason, you could run Crystal Grotto. You could run it in a mono-color deck, just because you can afford a couple of colorless land slots and it gives you some free scries. It can also help you hit an off-color activation you only have 1 or 2 copies of in the deck. Really, this is a standard playable land right here. It's not a super high value one, but it's only a common. Go for it. You might have some copies already. Edgewall in, this one's new. It's uncommon. Enters battlefield tapped. You get to choose a color, add 1 mana of the chosen color, so it can kind of color fix your mana. Since it only makes 1 color, sometimes you have to walk a little bit of a tightrope in a multicolor deck, but still, it's a useful ability. You cannot be stopped from having 1 color of mana that you need. That's nice. Sometimes, if it's green, for example, that can get you to the other colors of mana. The other thing this can do is pay 3 and tap and sacrifice it. Return target card that has an adventure from your graveyard to your hand. If you can afford tap lands in your deck, and again, if you're running Azusa's Many Journeys, or the Worm with a Plant Beans adventure. You could get extra tap lands onto the battlefield pretty easily. Those cards work especially well if you go above 24 lands in your deck. It's really nice to be able to hit the extra land drops if you're running that strategy. So, just to let you know, you might want to run like 26 to 30 lands if you're doing that. And you will get them on the board because you're running the cards to get them on the board. And if you are running that deck, this land later in the game can let you regrow adventure creatures, such as the Worm with the plant beans. I think that Worm is a 5/4 with reach, so it's a... or is it trample? Either way, it's a relevant 5/4 with a keyword. And 5/4s are big enough to trade with Sheoldred and some of the other big nasties of the format. So I do believe this card could have a home. I really do. Now, it only plays well with things that have adventures. You probably don't want to play it in any deck that doesn't have adventures. Adventures are good, though. There are some really good, solid, utilitarian, nice adventure creatures. So I would say go for it. This is just an uncommon. I'm going to craft it. I would tell you to do the same. I think that this card has work to do in Standard. Even though it can't go into every kind of deck, I think adventure creatures are going to show up in a wide enough variety of decks, and this can fix your mana in a wide variety of decks, then it might be worth it. It's worth testing, and it's just an uncommon. Then we've got Evolving Wilds. Evolving Wilds is a reprint. We already have it in Standard. It's a perfectly serviceable fetch land. There are strategies and creatures that work well with fetch lands. Titania is one of them, Voice of Gaia. Or Slogurk, the Overslime, is another one who works very well with fetch lands. Green has an artifact for 4 that lets you play lands from the graveyard. You can just do it over and over again. White has an Angel that lets you play like things that are value 3 or less, including lands from the graveyard. And when they leave the second time they exile, you gain 2 life, which again would also be useful. There are ways. There are ways of making these very simple fetch lands more than the sum of their parts. To where you can recycle them, use them over again. If you're doing that, then yeah, it's a good card. You might already have it. If you don't, you should strongly consider crafting some. Just as a heads up, there are some similar lands in Streets of New Capenna that are also common. They only search for 3 of the 5 basic land types, but they gain you a life when they do so. And if you don't need those other 2 colors, the life gain on those cards, why turn it down? Why say no? So if you're running a deck that is specifically the colors of those Streets of New Capenna lands, they are superior, in that case, to Evolving Wilds. Otherwise, sure, run Evolving Wilds. And that's going to bring us to the end of artifacts. Colorless. Colorless and lands. And go ahead and craft these. Alright. So yeah, just want you all to know that I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I am burning my own wild cards on things that I think are worthwhile. I wouldn't tell you or even suggest to waste your wild cards unless it was something I thought was worthwhile. So here on my free-to-play account, I'm willing to do this. So I believe in what I say. And I hope that you're enjoying this series. Please like and subscribe, and check out my other videos. Checking out the other videos is the big one. That's the one that really helps out. For example, you could check out the other videos of the Deckbuilding Toolbox series, if you haven't seen them already. And until next time, Never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.